I'm glad to be here. I am really, really grateful for the warmth of your welcome and a lovely spring evening in Memphis. You know, we do spring really well. I was home to visit my mother during Easter. In fact, ended up being gone that whole week for a couple of different reasons, and I had to talk to the cherry trees really passionately about holding on till I got back. Because, like everything was early, and they did, and I was eternally grateful for that. So, warm spring evening, the women of Holy Communion, an opportunity to come talk about one of my favorite subjects. Can't beat it. So, thank you very much. Let me start with a couple of texts of Scripture, and you'll figure out pretty quickly, not going to be long, you'll figure pretty quickly. I'm sort of sandwiching the thing I'm going to talk about, okay? Actually, you won't figure it out till I get in the middle of what I'm talking about, but bear with me on that one. All right, Mark chapter 15, verses 40 and 41. The immediate aftermath of the crucifixion. There were also women looking on from a distance, and among them were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the Younger and of Joses, and Salome. These women used to follow him, and this translation says provided for him. It's a horrible translation. Talk about that in a minute as I go. Provided for him when he was in Galilee, and there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem, witnessing the crucifixion. And then, text out of the Gospel of John. I wouldn't be surprised if for many of you, this is a favorite text, particularly during Eastertide. Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" I will just observe, normally what angels say to people, the very first thing they say, don't be afraid, or fear not, as you say. They don't say that to Mary. She apparently is so caught up in her pain that it doesn't even register with her. She's having a conversation with angels. So they don't say, "Don't be afraid." So they say, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've laid him." And when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? For whom are you looking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said to her, "Don't cling to me, because have I not yet ascended to the Father? But go to my brothers, go and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." Nerd that I am, and I am, I get to spend my vocation with my nose stuck in a New Testament. And while some of you probably would go, "Ew," at that, I love it. I get to do that. I get to participate in the work that allows me to explore this. I get to know the stories, and I get to know the people. And so this story is about the people that were there. Excuse me, let me fiddle with my notes for just a second because they are out of order. they're okay. Sometimes they surprise you. But this particular story comes to me today, or I'm using it today, and it's something of a surprise to me. I had actually been thinking of something else for this evening's gathering with all of you, a different kind of observation that I was going to have for all of you, and then Holy Week came around. And I ended up spending Holy Saturday with Mary Magdalene. I didn't plan on it. It's just kind of what happened. And she had a few things to say, including for me to tell you her story here tonight, so I thought I would. We begin to do that, though, by reminding us of what we know about Jesus back in the day when Jesus was hanging out in Galilee and announcing to people that God was doing this enormous thing, this fulfillment of the promises that God had made to the Jewish people, through them to be a blessing to all the world, when Jesus was announcing that that fulfillment had happened. And the consequences of that, the kingdom of God has drawn near, and he went and called the people to hear that good news, as we say. But he was there, and he was calling to these group of people and forming what I think must have been what today, we would call a motley crew of people. Hanging out, with him, they were fishermen and tax collectors and zealots and farmers. They were women, and they were old and young, and probably even some prominent folks as well, hanging out with Jesus. And many of these were people who had been told all of their lives that you are at best barely worthy to be in God's presence. We'd kind of go, like that if it were us. And some of them had been told that they were completely unclean and unwelcome and unworthy of God's presence. But Jesus is out there going, not so. Not so. You are beloved children of God, and you need to come and be with me. And they heard, and they responded, and they did. And you end up with this motley crew of people. Don't you know they were a strange-looking bunch as they moved through Galilee? And some of them probably came and went. They didn't necessarily drop everything and be with Jesus like wholly and completely after that, but they would come and be with him while they could, and then they had to go back because they had kids to feed, and that things that many of you have, and then they would rejoin, and then they would go back. So it was this bustling group of people hearing this good news and joining in a significant way that they illustrated for one another and for the others who were wondering if they should join in was the way that they sat down at table together. Since we're in a room where we're doing that. This was a world where you only ate with people like yourself, unless your name was Jesus of Nazareth, because you sat down to eat with anybody who wanted to sit down and eat with you, who wanted a place at the table, and they did, and they, the most common charge, leveled against Jesus by his opponents. He eats with tax collectors and sinners, to which Jesus would have responded, yes, and your point would be what? These were tough times, and these were struggling people, and these were hurting people, struggling people. And yet, this is one of the most phenomenal things to me about the gospel stories of Jesus. Everywhere he went, somebody was throwing a dinner party for him. I mean, we have dinner and we invite friends and we do gatherings like this, and it's not that, it's not particularly noteworthy. But in this world where people were poor and struggling, it is noteworthy. And they gathered with him. Everywhere he went, somebody was throwing a dinner party. And there would be this joyous gathering and this joyous celebration, and everybody had a plate and a spot in the buffet line. Or if they didn't, if the host decided that he was going to restrict participation, he ended up getting a lecture or a parable explaining to him how next time he was going to invite everybody to the buffet line. By the way, if you're ever in a situation where somebody like Jesus says to you, I want to tell you a parable, you need to say, no, please don't. I get tickled, these folks, Jesus will say that, and they'll go, speak, teacher, and I'll think, boy, did you just blow it. As he broadened them. And so here again, this motley crew, this motley table fellowship, this welcoming, beckoning, inviting, hospitable, generous, sharing group. And prominent among them and illustrating even further the wideness of God's mercy were the women that were participating in this movement. Again, in a world where women and men never ate together, they did if they were Jesus. If they were with Jesus, they sat and ate together, and women were prominent among his followers. And again, further illustrating the ways in which Jesus really did announce that God's kingdom is coming, and all of us are children of God, and there is no more us and them. Think about what happens when we do us and them. And nothing good. Nothing good. Jesus didn't do that. So the women also were prominent among those followers of Jesus, and prominent among the women is our friend Mary Magdalene. There are several times actually in the New Testament where groups of women disciples are named. Very often 3 names, and the name that is always first is Mary of Magdala. Kind of like Peter, James, and John. We get accustomed to the 3 male disciples' names, and there are several places, 3 women disciples. The other 2 names will vary a little bit. Mostly it's somebody named Mary. I mean, really? I have one of my courses at the seminary that formerly I called Gospel Stories of Women. I've renamed, and the name of it now is Mary, 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 and Martha. I'm not even kidding. I really have done that, But Mary of Magdala is always listed first, which speaks to her leadership among the disciples. And by the way, not just among the women disciples, but among the disciples. In fact, it is possible that Mary of Magdala, not Peter, was Jesus' most trusted disciple. It is entirely possible that his movement survived after his death and then resurrection because she was there. The story that I read to you from Mark 15 tells us that the women were there, or at least some of the women were there at the moment of crucifixion. Our best historical reconstruction of that moment is that the vast majority of Jesus' Galilean followers, and that was most of his followers at this point, had already left the city. But not Mary. I found myself on Holy Saturday, there with her, trying to imagine that day, trying to figure out what it would have been like on that first Holy Saturday. Well, we know it would have been awful. But what is awful like on a day like that? And so I found myself spending that day with her and hanging out with her and wondering, which is worse? Soul-crushing grief or gut-wrenching fear? And thinking to myself how no human being ought to ever be in a position to know the answer to that question. But the early followers of Jesus were in such a position, and most of them, as best we can tell, had let the fear take over, and they had left. Not in Jerusalem by the time Saturday rolled around. But Mary was there. She was there, she and the women friends who were there, and they witnessed the crucifixion. They were there to see where he was buried. And she was there on Easter morning to receive the news that just tops all news. When I was thinking about her that day, Holy Saturday, and thinking about her and her having stayed, you know, that's a powerful word. She stayed. She was there. At some point on that Saturday, she decided that she was going to attend to his body the next day, Saturday being Sabbath, and so you didn't do it that day, but the next day she was going to attend to his body, and by God, the threat that all that was didn't stop her. I find myself wondering sometimes if she told anybody, or she got the women to help her do it, and if anybody said, "You're not really going to do that, are you?" Because the threat would have been, potentially significant, enormous even. And if they said that to her, I wouldn't be surprised if they got their heads bit off in response. So she was there. She stayed, and because of her, it may well be that you and I are here in this place tonight, that you and I call ourselves Christian, because she stayed, and she was there to get the news of resurrection and share it with the rest of them. And I found myself on Holy Saturday thinking of that day and her staying and being sort of overwhelmed with that sense of what that took on her part to stay. And you know what dawned on me? We have heard, for example, the story of Peter's denials over and over again. And I get that, because we all need a story of somebody who failed miserably and got back up. We need that story. So we know that story. But this is the story of the woman who stayed. And we don't tell her story. If we know a story about Mary Magdalene at all, we might know a story of a repentant whore who was saved only because God's grace is so enormous. The story of a prostitute weeping at Jesus' feet, washing them with her tears, drying them with her hair, and whom God saved because God is just that gracious. The reason, by the way, that you may know that story, that we usually know that story, is because not too many decades passed from the time of Jesus' resurrection, when men, who were accustomed to wielding power in the larger culture, began to insist that they needed to wield power in the growing Jesus movement. And the truth is, the larger culture for these men really wasn't so bad. So they were not interested in quite so much revolution or renewal. They preferred to just tweak things a little bit. We're kind of good at that, right? And so they said, there would be bishops and there will be councils of elders who will make decisions for the church, and those positions will all be held by prominent men, of course. And slaves should be obedient to their masters, even the ones who mistreat them, rather than expecting the church to support them towards becoming free. And women should learn in silence, behave themselves according to cultural standards for the women, never have authority over a man, and be submissive to their husbands. It actually took several hundred years for them to consolidate power in the church. We have archaeological find of a Bishop Theodora into the 4th century. I wish I knew her. It took several hundred years for these prominent men to consolidate their power, but they finally did. And when they did, they buried the traditions of Mary Magdalene as Jesus' trusted companion, as his constant companion, as the one who understood better than any of the others. One tradition actually calls her the inheritor of the light. That got buried. And they took her story and pressed it together with another story. You all know what inflation is, right? Something gets bigger. So conflation. They conflated her story with another story. The one about the penitent prostitute weeping at Jesus' feet. And by the way, that's a wonderful story. It's just not Mary. But they brought those stories together, and the woman who was a hero became a whore. Here's the good news. You were hoping there was some, right? They buried those traditions. But buried is not the same thing as destroyed. Some of those early followers of Jesus, the ones who caught his vision of renewal and transformation, told and retold those stories, even when others told them not to be quite so revolutionary, or, to be blunt, sometimes they were told to shut up. They didn't. And some of them wrote those stories down. And some of them took those written stories and put them in clay jars. And some of them put those clay jars out in the Middle Eastern deserts, where they ended up being covered over by blowing sands and collapsing caves, and where the hot, dry desert climate preserved those writings. Who knows? Maybe the Spirit was hovering over, making sure they were protected and preserved. It took a long time for us to find them. A long time. 1,800 years, as a matter of fact. But they were finally found in the middle of the 20th century at a place called Nag Hammadi in Egypt. And there, among the writings, were the traditions of Mary Magdalene that had been buried. Turns out she was a preacher, not a prostitute. Turns out she was a leader, not a woman intent on being submissive. Turns out she was not a quiet follower, but a troublemaker in the best sense of the word. A friend asked me a few years ago if I was getting into respectable trouble. Isn't that great? And then his next question was, and if not, why not? Mary was a troublemaker in the best sense of the word. She was not, however, for those of you who've heard this and wondered, she was not, in all likelihood, Jesus' wife either. You've heard those stories. You probably read the Da Vinci Code. Frankly, if she'd been his wife, her role in his movement wouldn't have been so threatening, wouldn't have needed hiding. But a strong, independent woman whom Jesus trusted, whose support and partnership Jesus depended on, That woman was a problem for the new church power brokers who wanted to keep women in an inferior place. So they hid Mary Magdalene away. But we are finding her again. Look, if nothing else, when you walk out of here tonight, I want you to know she was not a prostitute. You got it? We are finding her again, and I am convinced that there are any number of marvelous lessons for us to gain from this story. As a woman in Jesus' movement in our time, I am thrilled beyond measure to find a grandmother, a role model, a source of great wisdom and encouragement, a hero who is a woman. Do you know one of the most devastating pieces of having one's history erased? Which is, what I should say, because I've been using the image of buried, of having one's history buried, is then people can say, well, you've never done that. You've never been this. You've never accomplished that. When your history is buried, then others can tell you your history for you. Okay, we're uncovering our history. And our history includes this grandmother who was wise and strong, who understood Jesus maybe better than anybody else during his lifetime, who was, I said a minute ago, called the inheritor of the light, who was our hero. But the encouragement that she offers is not just for me, and it's not even just for women. But tonight I'm telling her story to women who are here. And I call you now to hear the good news from this woman's story. If you have ever had, or still have, a vision, a dream, something that you have believed in deeply, maybe worked toward with great energy, but that effort seems to be coming to nothing. If you ever did something or are doing something for God, maybe understood yourself to be called to this work by God, and maybe have given a lot of yourself to it, and very few, if anyone, notices or seems to value what you have done or are doing. If there is some kind of ministry that you as an individual, or y'all, don't you love Southern English sometimes, right? Or y'all as a group of women have wanted to do or hoped to do or hoped would come into being. And I'm not talking just about vocational ministry, which is, how people think of me. One of the things that's really wrong in my mind with language in church is that I have this, I don't know what to call it, reverend thing in front of my name. It's not a title. I don't know what you call it. And so people think I'm a minister and you aren't. That is wrong. I am called to vocational ministry, but you are also called. And for those of you who feel like you have been called or this group is called, and there is something that has been in your heart or your hearts, plural, and is there because of your faith, it is your sense of what God can do and will do and wants to do with and through all of you, but it's not happening yet. If you have ever observed that without church women, the church itself would come undone, can I tell you that in my snarky moments, I think sometimes of all of us getting up and walking out, and saying back over our shoulders, good luck with that. And then I get over my snarkiness. Okay. But if you've observed that, and also know that our work, our prayers, our wisdom, our support have gone unnoticed year after year as if it is buried in the desert sand. Well, friends, I got good news. Mary's story is a story of hope. Her story was literally buried in the sand. It was not destroyed. It did not end. It was not gone. It has come back. And it is changing the way we look at ourselves, our place in the church. She tells us, her story tells us, that God is a God of hope. And we have been called to hope. And so, let us hope on. Let us hope that our spiritual journeys are leading us to become the people God created us to be, even on those days when we feel like we are wandering lost in a desert. Let us hope that this community of women can become and can embody and can do the ministry that God is calling you to be and to do in this corner of God's world. Let us hope that a renewal of creation is yet possible, that God is still with us, that the Spirit hovers all around us, preserving, protecting, guiding us to be the people God has called us to be. Let us hope that love never fails. 1,800 years. Mary's story was hidden away and lost. Love never fails. Let us learn from the story of our grandmother who stayed and was present to follow Jesus all the way to the cross and to the empty tomb, and whose story endured the desert to show us how to be people of hope. I have seen the Lord, she said, on that first Easter Sunday. By the way, the first time anybody ever said that. I have seen the Lord, she said. Yes, she had. And she is calling us to be her granddaughters. Let's say yes. Let's say yes. Mary, we have found you. We're not letting you go again. We will follow as you have taught us to do. Thanks be to God. And amen.